This story comes from a viewer named Alex who grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the late 1990s. Alex's childhood was, by all accounts, normal and happy. He had loving parents, a close group of friends, and a comfortable home. But for a period of about 6 months when he was 8 years old, his nights were plagued by a recurring nightmare that he says still haunts him to this day. The nightmare always started the same way. Alex would find himself in his bedroom, the moonlight streaming through the window, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. He would be lying in his bed, paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. And then he would see him, the man in the window. He was a tall, thin figure, silhouetted against the night sky. He never moved, never made a sound. He just stood there, watching. Alex could never make out his features, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the man was smiling. Alex would lie there for what felt like hours, his heart pounding in his chest, until he would finally manage to force his eyes shut. When he opened them again, the man would be gone, and the sun would be rising. He told his parents about the nightmare, but they dismissed it as a product of an overactive imagination. "It's just a bad dream, sweetie," his mother would say. "There's no man in the window." But to Alex, it felt real. The fear was real. And the man in the window was always there, night after night. One night, the nightmare changed. The man was no longer just standing in the window. He was opening it. Alex watched in horror as the man slowly, deliberately, slid the window open and began to climb into his room. He was still just a silhouette, but now he was inside, a dark, menacing presence in the one place Alex was supposed to feel safe. The man walked to the foot of Alex's bed and stood there, looking down at him. Alex could feel the man's cold, malevolent gaze, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the man was going to hurt him. He tried to scream, but no sound would come out. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of this silent, smiling intruder. And then Alex woke up. He was drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He looked at the window, expecting to see it open, but it was closed and locked just as it always was. He told his parents about the new nightmare, and this time they were more concerned. They could see the genuine terror in his eyes. They tried to reassure him, telling him that it was just a dream, but they also started taking precautions. They installed a new lock on his window and even bought him a nightlight. For a few nights, the nightmare didn't return. Alex started to feel safe again. He thought that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then it came back. And this time, it was worse than ever. The man was in his room again, standing at the foot of his bed. But this time, he spoke. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "I've been waiting for a long, long time." The man reached out a hand, and in the dim light from the nightlight, Alex could see that his fingers were long and thin like spiders' legs. He reached for Alex's foot, and Alex could feel the cold, clammy touch of his skin. That's when Alex finally found his voice. He screamed, a raw, primal scream that echoed through the house. His parents burst into the room, their faces a mixture of fear and concern. The man was gone, of course. The window was closed and locked. There was no sign that anyone had been there. But Alex knew what he had seen. He knew what he had felt. The man in the window was real, and he was trying to get to him. After that night, Alex refused to sleep in his own room. He slept on the floor in his parents' bedroom, and even then, he would wake up screaming from the nightmare. His parents took him to a child psychologist who said that the nightmares were likely a manifestation of some underlying anxiety. The psychologist suggested therapy and even medication, but nothing seemed to help. The man in the window was always there, waiting for him in his dreams. And then, one day, the nightmares just stopped. Alex doesn't know why. He just knows that one night, he went to sleep, and the man wasn't there. And he never came back. Alex eventually moved back into his own room and tried to put the experience behind him. He grew up, went to college, and started a family of his own. He rarely thought about the man in the window, and when he did, he dismissed it as a particularly vivid childhood nightmare. Until a few months ago, Alex was visiting his parents who still live in the same house. He was helping his dad clean out the attic when he came across a box of old family photos. He was flipping through them when he found a picture of himself, taken when he was about 8 years old, playing in the front yard. In the background of the photo, you can see his bedroom window. And standing in the window, just barely visible in the reflection, is the silhouette of a tall, thin man. Alex says his blood ran cold when he saw it. He showed the photo to his parents, and they were just as shocked as he was. They had no explanation for it. They had never seen the man before, and they had no idea who he could be. Alex has the photo now, and he says he looks at it every day. He still doesn't know who the man in the window was or what he wanted, but he knows one thing for sure: it wasn't just a dream. Our second story comes from a woman named Maria, who grew up in a rural part of Mexico in the 1980s. Maria's family lived in a small village, and her childhood was filled with folklore and local legends. But there was one story that was more than just a legend. It was a warning. The story was about the old well at the edge of the village. The well had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and it was said to be a place of great power. Some said it could grant wishes, while others said it was a gateway to the underworld. But everyone agreed on one thing: you should never, ever listen to the whispers from the well. The whispers were said to be the voices of the dead, trying to lure the living to their doom. They would promise you anything you desired: wealth, love, power, but in the end, they would always lead you to a watery grave. Maria, being a curious and somewhat rebellious child, was fascinated by the story of the whispering well. She would often sneak out of her house at night and go to the edge of the village just to look at the well from a distance. She never got too close, though. The stories were enough to keep her at a safe distance. One summer, when Maria was 10 years old, a group of older boys from the village decided to test the legend of the well. They were teenagers, full of bravado and skepticism, and they didn't believe in the old stories. They thought it would be fun to spend a night at the well and see if they could hear the whispers. Maria's older brother, Carlos, was one of the boys. Maria begged him not to go, but he just laughed at her and called her a scaredy cat. "It's just a story, Maria," he said. "There's nothing to be afraid of." So, one moonless night, Carlos and his friends went to the well. They took with them a lantern, a bottle of tequila, and a deck of cards. They planned to spend the night drinking and playing cards, and maybe, if they were lucky, they would hear the whispers. Maria couldn't sleep that night. She was too worried about her brother. Around midnight, she decided to sneak out and check on him. She crept through the dark, silent village, her heart pounding with every step. As she got closer to the well, she could see the faint glow of the lantern and hear the sound of the boys laughing and talking. She hid behind a large rock and watched them. They were sitting around the well, passing the tequila bottle back and forth. They seemed to be having a good time, and for a moment, Maria felt relieved. Maybe her brother was right. Maybe it was just a story. But then, the laughter stopped. The boys fell silent, and they all seemed to be listening to something. Maria strained her ears, but she couldn't hear anything except the chirping of the crickets. And then, she heard a faint, whispering sound like the wind rustling through the leaves. But there was no wind that night. The air was still and heavy. The whispers grew louder, and now Maria could make out words. They were in Spanish, but they were spoken in a strange, ancient dialect that she didn't recognize. The voices were soft and seductive, and they seemed to be coming from the well itself. Maria watched in horror as the boys began to act strangely. One of them, a boy named Miguel, stood up and started walking towards the well, a dazed, dreamy look on his face. His friends tried to stop him, but he pushed them away, his eyes fixed on the dark opening of the well. "I can hear them," Miguel said, his voice a monotone. "They're calling to me. They say they have something for me." Carlos and the other boys tried to reason with him, but it was no use. Miguel was completely entranced by the whispers. He climbed onto the edge of the well and stood there, swaying back and forth. "Don't do it, Miguel," Carlos shouted. "It's a trick." But Miguel didn't seem to hear him. He just smiled, a strange, empty smile, and then he jumped. Maria screamed. The other boys rushed to the edge of the well and looked down, but it was too dark to see anything. They called Miguel's name, but there was no answer. Just then, a cold gust of wind blew out their lantern, plunging them into darkness. The whispers from the well grew louder, and now they were filled with a triumphant, malicious laughter. The boys panicked. They scrambled to their feet and ran back to the village, screaming for help. Maria was frozen with fear, unable to move. She could still hear the whispers, and now they were calling her name. "Maria," they whispered. "Come to us. We have something for you too." She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt a strange, irresistible pull towards the well, as if an invisible hand was dragging her forward. She was just a few feet from the well when she felt a sharp pain in her arm. It was her brother, Carlos. He had come back for her. "Run, Maria, run," he shouted, pulling her away from the well. They ran back to the village as fast as they could, the sound of the whispers chasing them all the way. The next day, the men of the village went to the well to search for Miguel. They lowered a rope and a lantern into the well, but they found nothing. The well was completely dry. Miguel was never seen again. The official story was that he had run away from home, but everyone in the village knew the truth. He had been taken by the whispering well. After that night, no one ever went near the well again. The village elders placed a large, heavy stone over the opening, and they performed a ritual to seal the evil within. Maria and her family moved away from the village a few years later, but she has never forgotten that night. She says she can still hear the whispers in her dreams, calling her name, promising her things that she knows she can never have. She wanted to share her story as a warning to others. There are some places in this world that are best left alone, and some legends that are best left untested. And if you ever find yourself near an old, forgotten well, and you hear whispers coming from the darkness, don't listen, just run. Our final story comes from a viewer named Ben, who experienced a series of terrifying events when he was 12 years old. Ben's story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most frightening things are the ones that are hiding in plain sight. Ben grew up in an old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. The house had been in his family for generations, and it was filled with history and character. But it also had a dark side, a side that Ben would come to know all too well. The strange occurrences began shortly after Ben's 12th birthday. He started noticing things out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement, a fleeting shadow. He would turn to look, but there would be nothing there. He dismissed it as his imagination, but the sightings became more frequent and more distinct. He would see the shadow in the hallway, in the living room, even in his own bedroom. It was always in the periphery, always just out of sight. One night, Ben was in his room, reading a book. He had a small lamp on his nightstand, which cast a warm, comforting glow. But as he was reading, he noticed that the corner of his room, the one farthest from the lamp, was unusually dark. It was a deep, inky blackness that seemed to absorb the light. He tried to ignore it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He put down his book and stared at the corner. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he began to see a shape, a form within the shadow. It was a tall, slender figure, about the height of a man. It was completely black, with no discernible features. It was just a void, a patch of darkness that was darker than the surrounding shadows. Ben was terrified, but he couldn't look away. He watched as the shadow figure slowly detached itself from the corner and began to move towards him. It didn't walk, it glided. It moved with a smooth, unnatural grace, and it made no sound. It was like a piece of the night had come to life. Ben wanted to scream, but he was paralyzed with fear. He could only watch as the shadow figure came closer and closer until it was standing right next to his bed. It leaned over him, and for the first time, Ben could see its face. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. It was just a smooth, blank surface. But Ben could feel its gaze, and he knew that it was looking at him with a cold, calculating intelligence. And then it reached out a hand. The hand was long and thin, with fingers like razors. It reached for Ben's chest, and he could feel an icy coldness as it passed through his skin and into his body. He felt a sharp, searing pain, as if something was being ripped out of him. And then everything went black. When Ben woke up, it was morning. The sun was streaming through his window, and the shadow figure was gone. He thought that maybe, just maybe, it had all been a nightmare. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw a long, thin scratch on his chest, right where the shadow figure had touched him. The scratch eventually healed, but the experience left a permanent scar on Ben's psyche. He became withdrawn and anxious, and he was afraid to be alone in the dark. He would sleep with the lights on, and he would always make sure that the corners of his room were well lit. The shadow figure didn't appear again for several weeks, but Ben could still feel its presence. He would catch glimpses of it out of the corner of his eye, and he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that he was being watched. One night, Ben was awakened by a strange noise. It was a low, guttural growl, and it seemed to be coming from inside his room. He sat up in bed and looked around, but he couldn't see anything. And then he saw it. The shadow figure was back, and this time it wasn't alone. There were two of them standing in the corner of his room. They were both tall and thin, and they were both staring at him with their blank, featureless faces. Ben was terrified, but he knew that he couldn't just lie there and let them get to him. He had to do something. He remembered a story his grandmother had told him, a story about how to protect yourself from evil spirits. She had said that you had to confront them to show them that you weren't afraid. So, Ben took a deep breath and stood up on his bed. He pointed at the shadow figures and shouted, "Get out of my house. You're not welcome here." For a moment, the shadow figures just stood there, as if they were surprised by his defiance. And then they began to retreat. They glided back into the corner of the room and disappeared into the darkness. Ben was shaking, but he was also filled with a sense of triumph. He had faced his fears, and he had won. The shadow figures never appeared in his room again, but Ben says that he still sees them sometimes, out of the corner of his eye. He knows that they're still out there, waiting in the darkness. He wanted to share his story to let others know that they're not alone. If you've ever seen a shadow figure, if you've ever felt that sense of being watched, know that you're not crazy. And know that you have the power to fight back. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey into the dark world of childhood nightmares. These stories are a chilling reminder that the fears of our youth can be just as real and just as terrifying as any adult horror. If these stories have sent a shiver down your spine, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to HauntZone for more true horror stories. And if you have a childhood nightmare that you've never been able to forget, we want to hear about it. Send your story to us, and you might see it featured on a future episode. Don't forget to check out our channel for more terrifying content. We have a whole library of true horror stories that are guaranteed to keep you up at night. Until next time, stay safe and try not to think about what might be lurking in the shadows of your own childhood memories. Thanks for watching HauntZone. We'll see you in the next one.